February 24th, 1991. The Saudi-Iraq border, 1200 hours. It should be the brightest time of the day. But here, inside the Saddam line, it is midnight. The retreating Iraqi army has set fire to hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells. The black smoke is so thick that it swallows the sun completely. Private Ahmed, an 18-year-old conscript in the Iraqi 7th Infantry Division, crouches in a trench. He is gripping his AK-47 assault rifle so hard his knuckles are white. He is terrified, but he feels safe in one regard: the earth. He is 5 feet underground. In front of him is a 10-foot-tall berm of sand. Behind that, razor wire. Behind that, a minefield. His commanders told him, "The Americans are soft. They will bomb us from the air, but they will not come into the sand to fight us man to man." Ahmed waits for the artillery whistle. He waits for the shouting of infantry. Instead, the ground begins to liquefy. A sound emerges from the smoke, not the chopping of a helicopter, but a high-pitched turbine scream. It sounds like a jet engine, but it is coming from the ground. The vibration shakes the dirt from the trench walls onto Ahmed's helmet. Suddenly, the sand berm in front of him, his only protection, starts to move. It rises up like a wave in the ocean. Ahmed looks up, and through the oily twilight, he sees it. A beast, an M1A1 Abrams tank. But it has mutated. Attached to its front is a 4-ton steel blade, a mine plow, gleaming with hydraulic power. The tank does not fire its gun. It does not stop. It drives straight into the berm. The wave of sand crashes down. Ahmed opens his mouth to scream, but the sand fills it instantly. The light goes out. The heavy tracks of the 60-ton tank grind overhead, compacting the earth, sealing the tomb. This was not a battle. This was a construction project, where the materials were sand and human beings. This is the story of the most controversial, ruthless, and effective tactic of the Gulf War. Before we dig up the truth, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Cold War impact. To understand the horror of that day, we must first understand the problem 2 months earlier. The Pentagon. American planners are looking at satellite reconnaissance of the Iraqi defenses. It is grim. Saddam Hussein has had months to build what he calls an impenetrable wall. The Saddam line is not just a few ditches. It is a masterpiece of defensive engineering based on Soviet doctrine. It stretches for miles. It includes triangular forts, fire trenches filled with crude oil ready to be ignited, and millions of landmines. Intelligence reports estimate there are over 500,000 Iraqi troops waiting in that desert. Many are battle-hardened veterans of the Iran-Iraq War. In that war, they learned that if you dig deep enough, you can survive almost anything. The US commanders, including General Norman Schwarzkopf, are haunted by the ghosts of history. They are thinking about World War I. They are thinking about the Battle of the Somme, where British troops walked into machine gun fire and died by the tens of thousands. They are thinking about the tunnels of Vietnam. If the coalition forces send infantry to clear these trenches, the old-fashioned way, soldier versus soldier, grenade versus grenade, the casualty projections are catastrophic. Estimates suggest thousands of American dead in the first week alone. The American public will not support a bloodbath. The war needs to be fast, and it needs to be decisive. Major General Thomas Rame of the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, is given the job of breaching this line. He calls a meeting with his top engineers and tactical officers. "I cannot send my boys into those holes," he says. "We need a way to kill the enemy without ever meeting them." Colonel Anthony Moreno comes forward with a solution. It is cold. It is calculated. And it relies on brute mechanical force rather than finesse. The plan is simple. Do not treat the trenches as military fortifications. Treat them as uneven terrain. We will not clear the trenches, Moreno decides. We will fill them in. The weapon chosen for this grim task is a modified version of America's main battle tank. Let's break down the tech, because this is where the US advantage becomes unfair. The M1A1 Abrams is already a predator. It weighs nearly 70 tons. It is powered by a Honeywell AGT-1500 gas turbine engine, producing 1,500 horsepower. This gives it massive torque, the pushing power needed to move mountains of earth. But the key component for this mission is the track-width mine plow, TWMP. This is not just a shovel. It is a sophisticated piece of heavy engineering manufactured by Ramta in Israel and adapted by the US. It consists of massive steel teeth that dig into the ground in front of the tank's tracks. Normally, it is designed to push landmines out of the way, flipping them to the side so they don't explode under the tracks. However, the engineers realize that if you lower the blade and drive at full power into a soft sand berm, the plow acts like a tsunami maker. It lifts tons of sand and pushes it forward and sideways. Then, there is the M9 Ace, Armored Combat Earth Mover. This is a dedicated, armored bulldozer that can keep up with the tanks. The strategy is a hunter-killer team, but not for shooting. The Abrams leads, smashing the berms and filling the initial trench. The M9 Ace follows behind, smoothing the ground and burying anyone the tanks missed. It is a terrifying application of industrial power. It turns the battlefield into a construction site and the enemy soldiers into mere debris. February 24th. The breach begins. The 1st and 2nd Brigades of the Big Red One line up. It is the largest concentration of armored power since World War II. From the Iraqi side, the experience is confusing. The airstrikes have stopped. The artillery barrage has lifted. There is a strange silence, broken only by the wind, howling through the burning oil fires. Then, the ground starts to tremble. Inside the lead American tank, the driver, a 20-year-old specialist, stares through his vision blocks. His thermal imaging display glows green and black. He can see the heat signatures of the Iraqi heads popping up from the trenches, hundreds of yards away. He steps on the accelerator. The turbine engine whines to a high pitch. The tank lurches forward, hitting 30 miles per hour. Plows down. The command comes over the radio. Hydraulics hiss as the heavy steel teeth drop into the desert floor. The tank shudders as it bites into the earth. Speed drops, but the momentum is unstoppable. The first line of Iraqi defenders sees the monsters emerging from the smoke. They fire their AK-47 rifles. The bullets spark harmlessly off the Chobham armor. They fire RPGs, but the reactive armor and the sheer speed of the tanks make them hard targets. Then, the collision. The M1 Abrams hits the sand berm. It doesn't crash. It pushes. The sand rises up. The driver of the tank cannot see the men he is burying. He only sees the dirt piling up and spilling over the sides of the plow. He feels the resistance in the steering handles. He pushes the throttle harder. Under the ground, it is chaos. Iraqi soldiers are firing wildly. Some try to climb out the back of the trench, but the M9 Aces are flanking them, pushing dirt from the rear. Radio chatter on the Iraqi frequency descends into madness. They are not stopping. They are driving over us. Command, we need support. The earth is falling on us. And then, static. One section of the trench line, defended by hundreds of men, is erased in less than 3 minutes. The American tanks move in a wedge formation. They drive parallel to the trench line, pouring sand into the ditch like a relentless conveyor belt. There is no time to surrender. There is no time to negotiate. If you are in the hole, you stay in the hole. The physical destruction is total, but the psychological impact is even deadlier. Warfare is about morale. Soldiers will fight if they think they can win. They will fight if they think they can die a hero. But there is no heroism in being buried alive like a worm. Word spreads down the line. The Iraqi soldiers in the 2nd and 3rd defensive belts watch through their binoculars. They see the smoke. They see the frantic waving of arms as their comrades disappear. They realize the Americans aren't playing by the rules of war they understand. An Iraqi colonel, who later surrendered, described the moment. "I saw the tank drive over the machine gun nest. The guns stopped firing. The tank did not slow down. I looked at my men. They were crying. They threw down their weapons because they did not want to be buried. Panic spreads like a virus. Suddenly the desert is filled with men running. Not attacking, running toward the American tanks. They are waving white undershirts, white flags, anything. They are climbing out of their protective holes because the holes have become traps. The Americans have to stop not to fight, but to process the thousands of prisoners flooding toward them. In just a few hours, the 1st Infantry Division clears a path through the impenetrable Saddam line. They create a safe lane for the entire US 7 Corps to pour through. The battle ends as quickly as it started. The official report from the 1st Infantry Division is chilling in its efficiency. No American soldiers were killed during the breach. Not one. But what about the Iraqis? To this day, nobody knows the true number. Colonel Moreno later estimated that hundreds, perhaps thousands, were buried. The exact figure is impossible to calculate because the bodies were never recovered. They remain there, preserved in the dry desert sand, encased in their own fortifications. When the news broke in the United States, it sparked a fierce debate. Headlines screamed, "US tanks bury Iraqis alive." Critics called it a war crime. They argued that it was inhumane, a violation of the dignity of life. But the Pentagon stood firm. They cited the laws of land warfare. An enemy in a trench, February 11th, 1965. A windowless room deep within the headquarters of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, on Znamensky Street in Moscow. The air was thick with the smell of strong tobacco and drying ink. Colonel Ivan Mikhailovich Repin, a man whose entire career was built on the bedrock of knowable facts and calculable threats, stared at the photograph on the polished mahogany table. It was a reconnaissance image, but unlike any he had ever seen. The light from the overhead brass lamp cast a golden sheen on its glossy surface. His analysts, young men with sharp minds trained to dissect the shadows in grainy aerial prints, were silent. They were used to the smudged, indistinct images from high-altitude balloons or the occasional lucky shot from a contact on the ground. This was different. This was blasphemy. The photograph showed a section of the Tyuratam Cosmodrome, the very heart of the Soviet space program. But it wasn't the subject that caused the blood to drain from Repin's face. It was the detail. He could see the individual railway ties on the tracks leading to the launch complex. He could distinguish between trucks and smaller support vehicles. With a magnifying glass, he swore he could almost make out the five-pointed red star painted on the side of a vehicle door. An aide, a captain barely 25 years old, cleared his throat. "Colonel, our sources say the Americans claim this was taken from orbit." Repin finally looked up, his eyes cold and hard. He picked up the photograph, the paper feeling impossibly solid between his fingers. He laughed, a short, harsh bark that held no humor. "From orbit? Don't be a fool, Captain. This is a fabrication. A provocation." He tossed the image back on the table. "They flew a drone, a new high-altitude craft, and got lucky. They want us to believe they have an eye in the heavens. They want us to panic." He turned to his senior analyst. "File it as a piece of American disinformation, a clever fake. We will not be rattled by their Hollywood tricks." But as Colonel Repin walked back to his private office, a sliver of ice-cold doubt pierced his doctrinal certainty. The detail wasn't just good, it was perfect. The shadows were correct for the time of day. The atmospheric haze was non-existent. What if it wasn't a trick? What if the Americans, who the Kremlin insisted were decadent and technically inept, had somehow achieved the impossible? This is the story of how that single, impossible photograph shattered the foundations of Soviet military secrecy and began a technological haunting that would last for the rest of the Cold War. It's the kind of story we uncover every week here at Cold War Impact. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the truth behind the secrets. The Soviet Union, from its very inception, was built on a principle of absolute control over information. It was what their leaders called a denied area. Its vastness, stretching across 11 time zones, was its greatest defensive asset. Secrets could be buried deep in the Siberian taiga or hidden in the sprawling closed cities that never appeared on any official map. The KGB and the GRU were masters of the physical world. They could track a person through the crowded streets of any European capital. They could turn an agent. They could steal a blueprint for a jet engine. Their entire intelligence apparatus was designed to counter threats they could see and touch. The West, in their view, was a known quantity. They could read its newspapers, listen to its radio broadcasts, and exploit the openness of its society. They believed they knew the enemy. America, in the mind of the Politburo, was a nation of loud, undisciplined cowboys who relied on brute force, not surgical precision. Their propaganda painted a picture of a society on the verge of collapse, riddled with inequality and dissent. Their technological achievements were dismissed as either stolen from German scientists after the war or isolated strokes of luck, unsustainable by a chaotic capitalist system. This deeply ingrained worldview informed their entire defense posture. They built entire armies behind the Ural Mountains. They constructed secret submarine pens deep into granite cliffs on the Kola Peninsula. They scattered their intercontinental ballistic missile silos across the frozen expanse of Kazakhstan. All of it was predicated on a single, unwavering belief that the enemy could not see what they were doing. The sky, they believed, was the final frontier of this secrecy. After the downing of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane in 1960, the Kremlin was triumphant. They had proven that American technology could not violate their sacred airspace with impunity. Their surface-to-air missiles, they boasted, had slammed the door shut at 70,000 feet. The heavens were safe. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had banged his shoe at the United Nations, basking in the humiliation of President Eisenhower. The message was clear: you cannot watch us. We will prepare our forces in secret, and you will never know when or where the blow will fall. They were so confident, so utterly convinced of the inviolability of their homeland, that they were intellectually unprepared for what was happening thousands of miles away in the clean rooms and design labs of California. The American intelligence community didn't see the U-2 incident as a defeat, but as a proof of concept. The appetite for overhead imagery was now insatiable, but the method of delivery had to change. The challenge was monumental, a task that bordered on science fiction. They needed to build an automated photographer, place it in the hostile vacuum of space, command it to take pictures of targets hundreds of miles below, and then somehow retrieve the physical film. This wasn't about building a bigger rocket or a faster plane. This was a program that required the seamless integration of a dozen bleeding-edge technologies. It demanded the world's most advanced cameras, with lenses ground to a perfection never before achieved. It required film emulsions from Kodak, so fine-grained they could capture unimaginable detail from impossible distances. It needed a capsule, a small, armored bucket that could survive the fiery heat of atmospheric re-entry, something no Soviet engineer had yet mastered for a return trip. And most audaciously, it required a fleet of specialized aircraft that could snag this falling capsule out of the sky with a giant hook, because letting it touch the ground in hostile territory was unthinkable. The program was codenamed Corona. Publicly, it was disguised as a scientific mission called Discoverer, supposedly studying space radiation and atmospheric density. The Soviets monitored the early launches, and they laughed. One after another, the rockets exploded on the launch pad, failed to reach orbit, or spun out of control. The return capsules were never recovered. To the GRU analysts watching from afar, it was a comedy of errors, confirming their every prejudice about shoddy American engineering. They were so busy laughing at the failures that they failed to grasp the terrifying philosophy behind them. The Americans were not aiming for a single, perfect success. They were iterating, learning from each spectacular explosion, refining their designs at a speed the rigid Soviet bureaucracy couldn't comprehend. They were treating failure not as a source of national shame, but as a data point on the path to inevitable success. And then, on August 18th, 1960, just 3 months after the U-2 was shot down, it happened. The capsule from Discoverer 14 re-entered the atmosphere, its parachute deployed, and a C-119 flying boxcar snagged it from the sky over the Pacific Ocean. Inside that bucket was 3,000 feet of film containing more photographic intelligence of the Soviet Union than every previous spy mission in history combined. The eye in the sky was open, and in that windowless room in Moscow, Colonel Repin and his analysts were still filing reports on why such a thing was technologically impossible. They were operating from a rulebook the Americans had just thrown into the fire. The first few batches of Corona film that made their way to Colonel Repin's desk were treated with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. The GRU's photo analysis department, the best in the Soviet Union, was tasked with a single objective: prove they were fraudulent. They subjected the images to every test imaginable. They analyzed the grain structure of the film, looking for signs of digital manipulation, a technology that barely existed even in theory. They measured the shadows cast by buildings and missile gantries, running complex calculations to determine the sun's angle. They cross-referenced the position of clouds with meteorological reports from their own weather stations. With each test, a quiet sense of dread began to creep through the department. The sun angles were perfect. The atmospheric conditions matched their records. The grain structure was unlike anything they had ever seen, impossibly fine yet consistent with high-resolution photographic film. Most damning of all were the objects themselves. One image showed the Plesetsk missile test site in northern Russia, a facility so secret that its existence was denied even within the upper echelon transfer of the Red Army. There it was, laid bare from above, its launch pads and support buildings rendered in shocking clarity. The analysts started to mock the program not because they thought it was fake, but as a defense mechanism against a truth they couldn't yet bring themselves to accept. They called the mysterious American program the PRISRAC, the Ghost. "The Ghost has been busy today," one analyst would mutter, passing a new image to his colleague. "It seems it flew over our new submarine pens near Murmansk." The laughter was hollow. They were baffled. How could the Americans possibly know where to look? These secret cities and military bases were pinpricks on the vast map of the Soviet Union. To photograph them with such precision, the Ghost would need to know their exact coordinates, a feat of intelligence gathering that was, in itself, terrifying. The official doctrine from the Kremlin, however, remained unchanged. These were provocations. The Americans were using a new generation of high-altitude drone, perhaps launched from aircraft carriers in the Arctic or from secret bases in Pakistan. The Politburo simply couldn't believe, refused to believe, that their entire nation was being systematically mapped from space. Their own space program, a source of immense national pride, was focused on spectacular firsts: the first satellite, the first man in space. The idea of using space for methodical, granular intelligence gathering was a concept so alien to their thinking, so outside their strategic paradigm, that they dismissed it as an inefficient American extravagance. They were so busy winning the public space race, they never realized they were losing the secret one. The moment of shock, the instant the laughter died forever, came not in a photo analyst's lab, but in the heart of the Soviet defense industry. The year was 1967. The Central Committee of the Communist Party was reviewing the progress of their top-secret anti-ballistic missile program, designed to protect Moscow from a nuclear attack. A GRU general, a stern, barrel-chested man named Voronov, was presenting the latest satellite imagery to a panel of ministers and marshals. He projected an image, clear and sharp, onto a large screen. It showed the Sari-Shagan test range in Kazakhstan. "Comrades," he began, his voice booming with confidence, "as you can see, the latest images from our own Zenit reconnaissance satellite show the construction of the new missile silo is proceeding on schedule." He pointed with a wooden stick to a circular structure on the ground. The room nodded in approval. The Zenit, a direct copy of the American Corona concept but years behind in capability, was a point of pride. Then, his aide placed a second projector on the table. "And now," Voronov said, a smirk playing on his lips, "we have an image of the same location, allegedly taken by the Americans." He switched on the second projector. A gasp went through the room. It was the same silo, but the image was a generation ahead in quality. It was taken from a sharper angle, revealing details the Soviet satellite couldn't see. But that wasn't the cause of the shock. An elderly missile designer, a man who had personally drawn the blueprints for the facility, stood up, his face pale. He walked slowly to the screen, his hand trembling as he pointed to a small rectangular shape near the silo. "What? What is that?" he stammered. On the American image, a small building was clearly visible, with a distinctive T-shaped antenna on its roof. The GRU general squinted. "A support structure, perhaps? A barracks?" "No," the designer whispered, his voice cracking. "That is the guidance radar control building. We only finished the foundation 2 weeks ago. It is not on our satellite's image because it was taken a month before. This American picture, it cannot be more than a few days old." A stunned silence fell over the room. The implications washed over them in a sickening wave. The Americans weren't just taking pictures, they were taking them continuously. They were watching the construction of their most secret facilities in near real time. Everything they did, every rivet they fastened, every trench they dug, was being observed, catalogued, and analyzed by an unseen enemy in the sky. The sheer scale of the American effort was horrifying. This wasn't one lucky shot. This was a system, a relentless, all-seeing eye that never blinked. The GRU general, Voronov, felt a cold sweat on his brow. His entire understanding of strategic intelligence had just been rendered obsolete. The game wasn't about stealing secrets anymore. The Americans were simply harvesting them from orbit like a farmer harvesting wheat. Their agents, their moles, their entire network of human intelligence seemed suddenly primitive, like sending a man with a rowboat to chart an ocean that the enemy was already mapping with a fleet of modern survey ships. That day, in that briefing room, the Soviet High Command was horrified. They realized the U-2 hadn't been the end of their problems. It was just the prologue. They had closed the door at 70,000 feet, but the Americans had simply kicked down the ceiling from 100 miles up. The vast, secret world they thought they inhabited was gone. It had been replaced by a terrifying new reality. They were living in a fishbowl, and the face staring in was American. The laughter had stopped. The mockery had turned to fear. The age of secrets was over. The shock within the Kremlin did not dissipate. It metastasized. The initial horror of being watched transformed into the grinding, soul-crushing paranoia of being known. The Soviet intelligence community, a vast and powerful apparatus built on the principle of knowing the enemy's secrets while perfectly protecting their own, had to confront a terrifying new reality. The foundation of their entire strategy was a lie. Colonel Repin's department at the GRU was fundamentally reorganized. Its primary mission was no longer simply to analyze American intelligence, but to wage a desperate, one-sided war against it. They were no longer hunters, they were prey, constantly trying to hide from a predator they could not see, hear, or touch. The first step was to understand the enemy. KGB and GRU assets worldwide were tasked with a single top priority objective: uncover the secrets of the American satellite program. What they discovered only deepened their despair. This was not one lucky satellite. It wasn't even a small handful. The Americans had created a relentless, systematic machine. They were stunned to learn the Americans were launching new Corona satellites, which they codenamed Keyhole, or KH, almost every month. The program wasn't an experiment. It was an assembly line. The Soviets had built a wall, and the Americans had responded by building a permanent siege tower in the heavens, one that could never be attacked. The symbol of this new, horrifying norm was not a sound or a sight, but a process. It began with the quiet confirmation from a Soviet radar station of a launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. A few weeks later, listening posts in the Pacific would intercept the coded radio traffic of American aircraft on a weather reconnaissance mission. And then, a week or two after that, the blow would land. A new set of photographs would arrive at the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., and through the opaque channels of international espionage, copies or detailed reports would eventually filter back to Moscow. Each new batch of images was a fresh violation, a new tearing away of the veil. The ghost they had once mocked had become the most productive intelligence agent in human history, and it worked for the other side. This systematic dismantling of Soviet secrecy played out across every domain of their military and industrial complex. One of the most devastating examples was the so-called missile gap. In the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, Khrushchev had engaged in a campaign of audacious nuclear bluffing. He boasted of producing intercontinental ballistic missiles, like sausages, creating a pervasive fear in the West that the Soviet Union held a massive strategic advantage. It was a lie, but a powerful one. Soviet rocket forces were, in reality, small, unreliable, and plagued with technical problems. They possessed only a handful of operational ICBMs, a fact known to only a tiny circle of men in the Politburo. Their entire nuclear deterrent rested on the enemy's fearful imagination. Then, the eye in the sky opened. The first Corona missions were tasked with a simple, urgent mission: find the missile sites. American analysts scanned thousands of square miles of the Soviet interior, looking for the distinctive launch complexes. And they found almost nothing. Where there were supposed to be hundreds of missile silos, they found empty steppes and quiet forests. For the Americans, this was a stunning relief. For the Soviets, when they eventually learned what the Americans knew, it was a catastrophe. A KGB analyst, reviewing a debriefing from a defector in 1968, was horrified to read that the Americans had a precise count of their entire ICBM arsenal and had known it for years. The bluff was over. The Americans knew exactly how weak they were. This knowledge shifted the psychological balance of the Cold War. The Soviets now lived in constant fear of a preemptive American first strike. They knew that the US president could look at a map in the Situation Room that showed every single one of their strategic missiles. The sausage factory was a myth, and the ghost in orbit had been the one to expose it. This new reality became the norm, a constant, draining pressure on the Soviet system. Soviet naval commanders, who took immense pride in their growing fleet of nuclear submarines, were particularly affected. The submarine bases on the Kola Peninsula, carved into solid rock and considered impregnable, were now mapped in exquisite detail. American satellites watched as new classes of submarines were constructed at the Severodvinsk shipyards. They tracked them as they were launched and as they departed for their first sea trials. A Soviet submarine captain, preparing to take his brand-new Victor-class attack submarine on its maiden patrol, would be briefed on American anti-submarine warfare capabilities. He knew that before his vessel even slipped its moorings, its existence was already a known fact in the Pentagon. Its unique acoustic signature, its performance characteristics, its very purpose had been studied from space. The vastness of the ocean, once the submarine's greatest ally, now felt much smaller. They were forced to operate under the assumption that they were being watched from the moment they left port. The element of surprise, the core principle of submarine warfare, had been stolen from them before they even went to sea. The impact was felt not just in the strategic arms race, but in conventional military planning as well. During the Sino-Soviet border clashes of the late 1962, both superpowers massed hundreds of thousands of troops along the Ushuri River. It was a tense, volatile standoff that threatened to erupt into a full-scale war between the two communist giants. The GRU dedicated immense resources to monitoring Chinese troop movements, relying on border patrols and human intelligence. They were stunned when, through back-channel diplomatic communications, it became clear the Americans had a more accurate picture of the battlefield than they did. American KH satellites were making regular passes over the disputed territories, photographing both the Soviet and Chinese sides of the border with impartial, relentless clarity. A Soviet general in the Far Eastern Military District, responsible for 1,000 miles of border, had to operate with the crippling knowledge that an analyst in Washington, D.C. likely had better, more up-to-date information on his own troop dispositions than he did. The American satellites could see the construction of new Soviet bunkers, the arrival of new tank divisions, and the establishment of new supply depots. They could see everything. The systematic nature of this surveillance created a deep-seated institutional fatalism. The Soviet system was built on grand, 5-year plans. They planned everything, from tractor production to nuclear strategy, years in advance. Now, they had to contend with an adversary who could react to their moves not in years, but in weeks or days. The long game of chess they were used to playing had been replaced by a frantic, defensive crouch. The ghost, the unblinking eye, the steady, periodic arrival of photographic truth had become the new, miserable norm. The official realization descended upon the Soviet leadership not like a lightning strike, but like a slow, creeping flood of ice water. In a series of tense, smoke-filled meetings in the mid to late 1960s, the heads of the KGB, the GRU, and the Strategic Rocket Forces laid out the horrifying truth to a grim-faced Politburo. The reports were unequivocal. The Americans, using their ever-improving series of keyhole satellites, had achieved what was termed strategic transparency. It was a clinical, bloodless phrase for a terrifying reality. The Iron Curtain had become a window pane. The Soviet Union, a nation obsessed with secrecy, a state that classified the locations of bakeries and the schedules of trains, had no secrets left from its primary adversary. The response was a mixture of fury, paranoia, and a desperate, almost frantic, call to action. The enemy could not be attacked, but it had to be fought. This began the great, futile war against the ghost in orbit. The first and most immediate response was to double down on their doctrine of military deception, maskirovka. If the Americans could see everything, then the Soviets would have to poison their vision with lies. It was a strategy born of desperation. Entire divisions of the Red Army were dedicated to this new form of shadow play. They became masters of illusion. Vast, sprawling Potemkin military bases were constructed in the Siberian wilderness, complete with inflatable T-72 tanks that could be deployed in minutes and looked utterly convincing from 100 miles up. They built life-size models of their new Typhoon-class submarines out of plywood and canvas, floating them in the harbors of their secret naval bases to confuse the American satellite count. They painted fake runways on open fields and constructed entire fake missile complexes, hoping to force the American analysts to waste countless hours trying to distinguish the real from the imaginary. But this strategy was a double-edged sword that cut the Soviets more than the Americans. It was colossally expensive, draining billions of rubles from a strained economy that could have been used to build real tanks and real submarines. And more importantly, it often failed. The American satellites weren't just taking single snapshots, they were observing over time. Analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center could watch a fake missile silo being constructed. They could see that the scorched earth around a fake launch pad was actually just painted concrete. They could detect the lack of thermal signatures from inflatable tanks, which didn't radiate heat like a real running engine. The Americans were not just looking at pictures, they were analyzing data. They were fighting a war of information, and the Soviets were trying to counter it with arts and crafts. While the army played with inflatable decoys, the Soviet space program was tasked with a more direct mission: to kill the ghost. Thus began the Istrebitel Sputnikov, or Satellite Destroyer program, a secret and hugely expensive effort to build an anti-satellite weapon, or ASAT. The concept was brutal and direct. They would launch their own killer satellite, a machine packed with sensors and a conventional warhead. This hunter would be maneuvered into a matching orbit with an American KH satellite, stalk it, and then, on command from the ground, detonate, blasting the American eye into a cloud of shrapnel. They achieved their first successful test in 1968, destroying a target satellite in orbit. To the Politburo, it was a moment of triumph. They had finally found a weapon that could strike back. But the victory was hollow. The Americans knew about the ASAT program almost from its inception. Their satellites had watched the construction of the launch pads at Tyuratam. The program was a reactive, not a proactive measure. It was a one-for-one exchange, and the Soviets simply couldn't keep up with the furious pace of American satellite production. For every eye they blinded, the Americans could launch 2 more. Furthermore, using the weapon in a real conflict would be a terrifying escalation, a signal that a ground war was imminent. It was a weapon they could build, but one they could barely afford to use. The psychological impact of this one-sided war on the Soviet system was profound and corrosive. For the engineers and scientists working in the Sharashkas and design bureaus, it created an atmosphere of utter futility. Imagine spending a decade of your life designing the MiG-25 Foxbat, a revolutionary interceptor built of steel and titanium, capable of flying at 3 times the speed of sound, all for the singular purpose of shooting down the Americans' new SR-71 Blackbird spy plane. Then, you learn that the Americans knew the exact dimensions and performance characteristics of your prototype before it ever flew, because a satellite had taken its picture on the runway at the Zhukovsky Air Development Center. Every innovation felt compromised from birth. Every secret was born into captivity. For military commanders, the constant surveillance was a strategic straitjacket. In 1968, when the Soviet Union prepared to invade Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, the Red Army massed its forces along the border. They planned the invasion under the assumption that NATO and the United States would be caught by surprise. They were horrified to learn later that American satellites had been watching their divisions assemble for weeks. The US president wasn't surprised. He was merely watching a tragedy unfold that he already knew was coming. This inability to achieve strategic surprise stripped Soviet military doctrine of its core tenet. They could no longer plan for a swift, decisive blow against NATO in Europe because they had to assume that any large-scale troop movement would be detected from orbit within hours. The entire western front of the Soviet Union was, in effect, under permanent surveillance. This constant, grinding pressure created a deep and lasting paranoia within the Soviet officer corps. They began to see the ghost everywhere. A junior officer would be punished for leaving a hatch open on a new tank prototype. A whole base would be put on high alert because a new camouflage net was late in arriving. They were living in a state of perpetual inspection by an invisible, unforgiving auditor who never slept. They were exhausted, not from fighting a war, but from the crushing, endless effort of trying to hide from one. The grand Soviet military machine, one of the largest in human history, had been reduced to scurrying for cover like mice under the shadow of a hawk. The ultimate victory of the K-hole satellite program was not measured in the number of missiles it counted or the troop movements it tracked. Its true triumph was its role as a relentless, factual narrator of the Soviet Union's systemic failure. The satellites did more than just photograph military hardware. They captured the slow, inexorable decay of the communist economic experiment. They saw the truth that the Kremlin's propaganda was designed to hide. This connection between military surveillance and economic reality became the final, crushing chapter in the story. American analysts, originally tasked with finding military threats, inadvertently became the world's foremost experts on the rot within the Soviet system. They were stunned by what the images revealed. They saw agricultural collectives in the Ukraine, the supposed breadbasket of the Union, lying fallow and unproductive, with rusting farm equipment sitting idle for lack of spare parts. They could see the endless queues snaking from state-run stores in provincial cities, a stark visual testament to the chronic shortages that defined Soviet life. They watched the environmental catastrophes unfold in near real time, the shrinking of the Aral Sea into a toxic desert, the plumes of pollution billowing from unregulated factories in the Urals. The ghost in orbit was no longer just a military spy, it had become an auditor of a failed state. This stream of undeniable photographic truth provided American policymakers with a profound strategic advantage. While Soviet leaders were reading doctored reports from regional party bosses claiming record harvests, the US president could see the truth of the impending famine with his own eyes. This knowledge allowed America to engage in a form of economic warfare that was subtle, devastating, and entirely one-sided. When the Soviets were forced to import massive quantities of grain from the West in the 1970 seconds and 80 seconds to stave off starvation, it was a decision predicated on a weakness the Americans had already mapped from space. They knew the exact extent of the agricultural failure and could leverage it in diplomatic negotiations. The industrial might that allowed America to build and launch these impossibly complex satellites was a direct reflection of the very system that was outcompeting the Soviets on the ground. Each K-hole satellite was a marvel of miniaturization, advanced optics, and computer processing, the products of a dynamic, consumer-driven technological ecosystem. It was built by companies like Kodak, Perkin-Elmer, and Lockheed, firms that thrived on competition and innovation. The Soviet Union, with its rigid, centrally planned economy, simply could not compete. Their best engineers were trying to copy technology that was already a generation old, while American industry was already inventing the next. The satellite was a symptom of the disease. The cause was a fundamental difference in philosophy. America's strength was its open, adaptable, and resourceful society. The Soviet Union's weakness was its closed, brittle, and inefficient one. The ultimate demonstration of this victory was not a battle but a collapse. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was the symbolic end of a confrontation that had been decided decades earlier in the silent, cold vacuum of space. The East German Stasi, once one of the most feared secret police forces in the world, were masters of a physical domain. They could bug an apartment, read a citizen's mail, and cultivate a network of millions of informants. But they were powerless against the eye in the sky. For years, American satellites had been mapping their every military installation, their every border fortification, their every secret police headquarters. The Stasi's power was built on a wall, and the satellites had been looking over that wall since the day it was built. When the people of East Berlin finally surged through the checkpoints, they were tearing down a structure whose strategic irrelevance had already been established from 100 miles up. The final verdict came in 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. The collapse was not caused by a military invasion, but by an implosion of economic and moral authority. The Soviet people had been promised a workers' paradise, but they had been given empty shelves and ecological ruin. The satellites had been the unblinking, objective witnesses to this grand failure. They provided the irrefutable evidence that the communist system didn't work. The ghost, born in the secrecy of the Cold War, had ultimately served as the historian of its conclusion. In the end, the story of the Corona and K-hole programs is a profound epilogue on the nature of power. The Soviet Union believed power came from secrecy, from control, from building walls and hiding armies. They built a society that was opaque, even to itself. The Americans, by contrast, discovered that true, lasting power came from knowledge, from transparency, from the ability to see the world as it actually was. They built a machine whose sole purpose was to strip away the lies and reveal the truth. In a Moscow archive today, a formerly top-secret GRU report from 1985 offers a chilling, poetic confession. The analyst, whose name is still redacted, was tasked with summarizing the strategic impact of 2 decades of American satellite reconnaissance. He wrote, "We have been living in a house of glass, believing it to be a fortress of stone. We have spent our wealth and our genius trying to build curtains, while the enemy simply stood outside, watching us through the windows. The most powerful weapon they possess is not a bomb or a missile, but a simple, undeniable photograph of the truth." The Soviet leadership had started by laughing at the idea of a camera in space. They were horrified when they learned it was real. But the final, crushing realization was that the camera did not just see their weapons or their bases, It saw their weakness. It saw their failure. And it broadcast that truth into the heart of their adversary's government, ensuring that the Cold War would be won not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, methodical analysis of light and shadow, captured from an impossible height.